I am Olivia, 33 years old, and a senior forensic accountant who just dismantled her own family company in exactly 24 hours. You are grounded until you apologize to your brother. My father screamed those ridiculous words at me in front of 40 elite guests. The entire room erupted in mocking laughter. My face burned with absolute humiliation, but I simply looked him dead in the eye and replied, "All right." The next morning he sneered, asking if I had finally learned my place. Then he noticed my room was completely empty. Seconds later, the family lawyer rushed in, his voice trembling as he asked what my father had done. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who completely underestimated your worth. Growing up in our affluent household meant playing a very specific role, and my role was the designated punching bag. The setting for my final night of tolerance was the grand ballroom of the city's most exclusive country club. It was the 35th anniversary gala for our family real estate firm. The crystal chandeliers above us glittered brilliantly, casting a warm, expensive glow over the white tablecloths and the towering floral arrangements. To any outsider looking in, we were the picture of American success. But sitting at that VIP table felt like being trapped in a beautifully decorated cage. The atmosphere was completely suffocating. I sat there in a pale silver evening gown I had bought with my own hard-earned money, quietly sipping sparkling water. As a senior forensic accountant for a top-tier firm, my daily life involved tracking down hidden assets, exposing corporate fraud, and holding powerful people accountable. I was highly respected in my field. Yet to my father Richard and my 35-year-old brother Cameron, I was nothing more than an inconvenient accessory. Richard was the authoritarian CEO who ruled our family with an iron fist, while Cameron was the undisputed golden child. Cameron was a vice president in title, only a man whose entire career consisted of wearing expensive suits, playing golf, and taking credit for other people's work. The evening dragged on with agonizing slowness. Our table was packed with high-net-worth investors, local politicians, and wealthy socialites. Cameron, practically buzzing with unearned arrogance, was holding court. He leaned back in his chair, swirling an overpriced Cabernet, and began spinning a fabricated tale about a recent commercial development deal. He bragged about his visionary strategies, inflating numbers, and claiming he single-handedly outmaneuvered the City Planning Commission. Every word out of his mouth was a complete lie. He had actually almost botched the zoning permits entirely, costing the firm a small fortune in legal fees to fix his mess. As Cameron reached the climax of his imaginary triumph, he looked directly at me. He loved using me as a prop to validate his ego. "Is not that right, Olivia?" he asked loudly, ensuring the entire table was listening. "Tell them how I totally salvaged the downtown commercial project." He flashed a smug, challenging smile, daring me to contradict him in front of our father's most important connections. Normally, I would have just nodded and looked away to keep the peace. I had been conditioned my whole life to swallow my pride for the sake of family harmony. But I was exhausted. I was tired of shrinking myself to make this incompetent man look taller. I took a slow breath and met his gaze without a trace of a smile. "I think the legal team salvaged the project, Cameron," I said evenly, "since you failed to file the environmental impact reports on time." The silence that fell over our end of the table was instantaneous and heavy. Several investors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Cameron's face turned an ugly shade of red. His charming facade slipped, revealing the petty, vindictive bully beneath. He picked up his wine glass, pretending to reach for a bread roll, and violently knocked his hand against my shoulder. The entire glass of dark red wine splashed directly onto my chest, soaking into the pale silver silk of my dress, and leaving a massive, glaring stain. "Oh, my mistake," Cameron said, his voice dripping with venom. "You should really watch where you are sitting, little sister." He did not even try to hide the smirk playing on his lips. The sheer disrespect snapped the last remaining thread of my patience. I stood up, ignoring the cold wine seeping through my dress. "You did not make a mistake with the wine, Cameron," I said, my voice ringing out sharp and clear over the quiet jazz playing in the background. "Just like you did not make a mistake when you completely ignored the commercial zoning restrictions on the West Side parcel. You do not know the first thing about commercial zoning, and everyone at this table knows it. You are a fraud playing dress-up in our father's company." Before Cameron could even open his mouth to respond, my father reacted. Richard slammed his heavy fist onto the table with such force that the crystal glasses rattled dangerously. The sudden violent noise brought the surrounding conversations to an immediate halt. 40 high-net-worth guests turned their heads to stare at our table. Richard stood up, his face twisted in absolute fury. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. "How dare you speak to your brother that way in public?" he roared, completely ignoring the fact that Cameron had just ruined my dress and tried to humiliate me. "You are out of line, Olivia. You are grounded. Go to your room at the estate, and do not come out until you are ready to apologize to your brother." For a moment, I honestly thought I had misheard him. I was a 33-year-old independent professional. I owned my own home, though I was temporarily staying at the family estate to help manage my sick grandfather's medical care. Yet here was my father screaming at me like I was an unruly teenager who had stayed out past curfew. He was literally grounding me in front of the city's elite. The room fell dead silent for a fraction of a second. Then someone at our table chuckled. It was followed by another laugh, and soon a ripple of cruel, mocking laughter spread through the crowd of 40 guests. Cameron joined in a triumphant sneer plastered across his face. My own parents stood there letting their friends laugh at my expense, entirely comfortable with my public degradation. My face burned with a heat so intense it felt like physical pain. Any other night in any other year I might have cried. I might have rushed out of the room in tears, letting them win. But as I looked at my father's red, furious face and my brother's cowardly smirk, I felt a sudden, profound shift inside my chest. The anger dissolved into pure, freezing ice. I looked at my father with dead, cold eyes. The laughter around the table slowly died down as my unnatural calm unsettled them. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. "All right," I said quietly. I picked up my purse, turned on my heel, and walked out of the grand ballroom, my head held high despite the wine dripping down my dress. They thought they had put me in my place. They thought they had won. But as I walked to my car, I knew my father had just made the most catastrophic mistake of his life. I barely made it to the grand foyer before a heavy hand clamped down on my shoulder. The grip was bruising fingers digging into my collarbone. I was spun around so violently that the wet silk of my ruined dress slapped against my legs. It was my father. His face was no longer the mask of a righteous offended patriarch defending his son. It was the face of a desperate cornered animal. Cameron flanked him, looking nervously over his shoulder at the lingering event staff. "Get in here," Richard hissed, his voice dropping an octave as he shoved me toward the heavy oak doors of the private VIP coat room. He pushed me inside, and Cameron quickly shut and locked the door behind us. The muffled sounds of the jazz band playing in the ballroom vanished, replaced by the harsh, heavy breathing of two men who were completely losing their grip on reality. The smell of damp wool and expensive cologne hung thick in the small, windowless space. I stood my ground, smoothing down the front of my ruined dress. "Are we doing a private encore of your little performance out there?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly flat. "Or did you drag me in here to throw another drink on me?" My father did not yell. In fact, his voice became terrifyingly quiet. "Drop the attitude, Olivia. That display out there was necessary to establish a narrative. Now you are going to listen to me, and you are going to do exactly as I say." Cameron paced the narrow aisle between the coat racks, running his hands through his perfectly styled hair. His smug arrogance from the dinner table had completely evaporated. He looked like a terrified child. "Tell her, Dad. Just tell her so we can fix this. Fix what I asked." My father stepped closer, invading my personal space. "Your brother made a minor miscalculation with the operational accounts last month. He was trying to aggressively grow the firm liquid assets. He invested a portion of the development fund into a decentralized digital currency platform." I stared at him, my forensic accountant brain instantly translating his corporate jargon into the truth. I looked at Cameron, who was actively avoiding my gaze. "You put company money into crypto," I stated. "It was a guaranteed return." Cameron whined, finally stopping his pacing. "The broker showed me the projections. It was supposed to triple in 3 weeks. We could have bought out the entire waterfront block. And the broker disappeared. I guessed, feeling a cold wave of realization wash over me. The platform collapsed. How much did you lose, Cameron? He swallowed hard, looking at our father for permission to speak. When Richard gave a stiff nod, Cameron mumbled the number. $2.5 million. The sheer magnitude of his stupidity was breathtaking. $2.5 million of company operating funds gone. Vanished into the digital ether because the golden child wanted to play venture capitalist. But the shock quickly faded into an understanding of why I was currently locked in a coat room. The public grounding had nothing to do with me disrespecting him at the dinner table. It was a calculated setup. They needed me isolated. They needed to break me down. So you lost $2.5 million, I said, keeping my expression entirely neutral. That is a catastrophic loss, but it is a board issue. Why drag me into a closet? Because the IRS quarterly deadline is at the end of the week, Richard said, his eyes narrowing. And the board does not need to know about this. We are going to reallocate that missing money on the books. We are going to classify it as an emergency materials purchase for the new downtown high-rise project. Construction costs fluctuate all the time. It will blend right in. I let out a harsh, humorless laugh. You want to commit tax fraud and embezzle $2.5 million on paper. You have a whole accounting department for your daily operations. Make them do it. My father grabbed my arm again. Do not play stupid, Olivia. The internal accounting team cannot sign off on an adjustment of that size without an external audit verification. We need a certified public accountant with forensic credentials to validate the emergency expenditure. We need someone the board and the federal government will not question. We need your signature. The pieces of their trap snapped together perfectly. They wanted me to leverage my spotless professional reputation to cover up a felony. If I signed those documents, I would be legally responsible for the missing millions. I would be the one going to federal prison when the IRS inevitably realized the construction materials never existed. Cameron would walk away entirely clean, while I took the fall for his massive criminal negligence. I will not sign it, I said, my voice steady and unwavering. I will not risk my freedom and my license to save your incompetent son. Richard's face contorted into an ugly snarl. He backed me up against the coats looming over me. You will sign it, Olivia. You will sign it tonight. If you refuse, I will personally make sure you never work in this state again. I play golf with the head of the state licensing board. I will have your CPA license revoked by Friday. I will tell them you approached me offering to cook the books for a payout. Who do you think they will believe? A powerful CEO or a bitter, disgruntled daughter? I did not flinch. He leaned in closer, his breath hot against my face. And if you think you can just walk away, remember where you are currently living. You are staying in my guest house to play nursemaid to your grandfather. If you do not sign these papers by tomorrow morning, I will throw you out on the street. I will evict you, and I will put my father in a state-run nursing facility so fast your head will spin. You will never see him again. He was weaponizing the only person in the family I actually loved. My grandfather was fragile, battling early-stage dementia, and the family estate was the only environment keeping him stable. Richard knew exactly where to strike to inflict maximum damage. He expected me to break. He expected me to cry, to beg, to negotiate, and ultimately to submit. That was the dynamic we had operated under for 33 years. Cameron smirked from the corner, his confidence returning now that our father was doing the heavy lifting. Just sign the damn papers, Olivia. Be useful for once in your life. I stood there, backed against a rack of expensive wool coats, my own dress ruined and clinging to my skin. I looked at the two men who shared my DNA, men who were perfectly willing to destroy my entire life to save themselves. I did not scream. I did not argue. I maintained a completely stone-faced demeanor. My silence seemed to unnerve them, but Richard mistook my calm for surrender. You are grounded, he repeated, his voice low and threatening. Go straight back to the estate. Go to your room. Think about your grandfather. Think about your career. I will send the documents to your email. You will sign them electronically before sunrise, or you lose everything. He unlocked the door, gesturing for me to leave. I walked out of the coat room without looking back, stepping into the cool night air. Before I could take a calming breath of the night air, the oak doors of the country club burst open. It was my mother, Cynthia. She marched down the steps, her designer heels clicking sharply. She did not ask if I was all right or why her husband had just humiliated me. Instead, her face twisted into pure indignation. "Olivia, stop right there!" she demanded, grabbing my wrist. "You have caused an absolute scene tonight. Do you have any idea how embarrassing it was to smooth things over after your outburst at the table?" I stared at her, feeling the icy dampness of wine seeping through my silk bodice. My father and brother stepped out, hovering like bodyguards. "You mean the outburst where Cameron ruined my dress and Dad screamed at me?" I asked. Cynthia waved her hand. "Do not play the victim. Your father told me everything. Honestly, Olivia, I cannot believe you are being this stubborn over a simple signature. Just sign the document so Cameron can have peace of mind. He has been under an immense amount of pressure lately, and he does not need his own sister making his life more difficult." A sickening knot formed in my stomach. She knew her son had embezzled $2.5 million. She knew her husband was trying to force me to commit federal tax fraud to cover it up. Her only concern was Cameron. She was perfectly willing to feed me to the wolves to ensure her golden boy did not face a single consequence. Before I could respond, the glass doors swung open again. This time it was Nia. Nia was 32 years old, an African-American woman with a fierce intellect and a presence that demanded respect. She was the founder of a highly successful luxury salon chain, building her empire relying on her own grit. Unfortunately, she was also Cameron's wife. I always wondered how a woman as sharp as Nia ended up with a man as hollow as my brother. But Cameron was a master of wearing masks, playing the supportive husband very well when it suited him. Nia walked down the steps, pulling her evening coat tight. She looked at my wine-soaked dress, the defensive posture of my father and brother, and the furious expression on my mother's face. "What is going on out here?" Nia asked, her voice calm, but carrying an undeniable edge of authority. "I came out to get the valet ticket and I find a family standoff. Cameron, what happened to Olivia's dress?" Cameron immediately stepped forward, sliding his arm around Nia's waist in a practiced show of affection. He let out a nervous, condescending laugh. "Oh, it is nothing, babe. Just a clumsy accident at the table. Olivia is just throwing a tantrum because she did not get a promotion at her firm. You know how she gets when she feels inadequate?" The lie was so smooth it was terrifying. He was gaslighting his own wife without missing a beat, painting me as an unstable woman to hide his criminal incompetence. Nia frowned, looking from Cameron to me. Her sharp eyes scanned my face, searching for the truth. "A promotion," she repeated slowly, clearly, not buying the absurd story. She was too smart to believe that a missed promotion would lead to a public screaming match and a ruined gown. Cynthia immediately chimed in, rushing to back up her son's lie. She plastered on a patronizing smile. "Yes, exactly. Olivia is just struggling to keep up in the corporate world. We cannot all have things handed to us. Cameron works tirelessly to keep this family afloat. You really should be much more supportive of your husband, Nia, considering exactly how much intense daily stress he puts up with just to provide a certain lavish lifestyle for you." The microaggressions in Cynthia's voice were not subtle. She hated that Nia came from a working-class background and that Nia had built her own wealth instead of relying on the family name. Cynthia constantly made these jabs, implying Nia should just be grateful to have married into our prestigious family. She spoke to Nia as if she were a charity case who needed to learn her place. Nia stiffened, her jaw clenching. She looked at Cynthia with a cold stare. "I provide for myself, Cynthia," Nia said, her voice dangerously quiet. "And my husband's stress does not explain why Olivia is standing in the freezing cold covered in wine." Cynthia rolled her eyes and turned away, refusing to engage further. Cameron tightened his grip on Nia's waist, pulling her toward the valet stand. "Drop it, Nia. I told you she is just being difficult. Let us just go home." Nia resisted his pull for a fraction of a second. She looked directly at me. I could see the doubt in her eyes. She knew they were lying. She knew there was something dark and twisted happening right beneath the surface. She was waiting for me to say something, waiting for me to defend myself, waiting for me to blow the lid off their perfect little narrative. But I also knew that if I spoke now, my father would follow through on his threat. He would rush to his country club connections and have my CPA license suspended before morning. He would move my grandfather to a miserable facility out of pure spite. I could not fight them on their terms. I had to fight them on mine. So I stayed completely silent. I did not argue. I did not defend myself against the lies about the promotion. I did not call out my mother's casual cruelty. I simply broke eye contact with Nia, pulled my keys from my purse, and walked toward the parking lot. Behind me, I heard my father let out a long, satisfied exhale. "See?" he muttered. "I told you she would fall in line. Give her until the morning. She will sign the papers." I drove to the family estate in silence. My phone buzzed constantly with reminders from my father's assistant demanding I review the audit files. He believed his public humiliation worked. He thought sending me to my room would break my spirit. Instead, he handed me the exact weapon needed to destroy him. He gave me undisturbed time. I parked around back. The estate was quiet. My grandfather slept in the west wing. I walked upstairs, peeled off the ruined wine-stained dress, and threw it in the trash. I did not shed a single tear. There was no room left for self-pity. My emotions had been replaced by clinical calculating focus. I put on comfortable clothes, locked the door, and pulled my encrypted work laptop from my safe. I set it on the desk, opened the screen, and cracked my knuckles. My father expected me to open the forged documents, apply my signature, and save Cameron from federal prison. I had a different agenda. I logged into the secure server using my credentials. As lead internal auditor, I possessed administrative access to every financial ledger shadow account, an offshore holding my family operated. I bypassed their internal security protocols within minutes. I did not just refuse to sign the fake audit. I initiated a full digital autopsy on the entire corporate structure. I started with the primary operating account. I needed to find exactly how Cameron managed to bleed $2.5 million without triggering a bank freeze. My fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up transaction logs from the past 45 days. The trail was sloppy. Cameron disguised the withdrawal as a bulk purchase order for industrial steel, routing the money through 3 subsidiary accounts to wash the transaction. But money never vanishes, especially not from an auditor who knows where to look. I tracked the wire transfers layer by layer. The money moved from the corporate operating account in Boston to a holding company in Delaware. From there, it was wired offshore. I followed the digital breadcrumbs directly to a shell corporation registered as an LLC in the Cayman Islands. It was a classic embezzlement funnel. But Cameron was greedy and impatient. He did not let the funds sit in the Cayman account. Less than 24 hours after the transfer cleared, the $2.5 million was rerouted into an unregulated cryptocurrency exchange in Eastern Europe. He had dumped the stolen fortune into a highly volatile altcoin that crashed to zero 3 days later. Finding the missing money was only the first half of my mission. Now I needed to legally chain that loss directly around my brother's neck. I dug deeper into the server logs. I extracted the raw data packets associated with the initial outgoing wire transfers. I compiled the specific IP addresses used to authorize the transactions. They did not originate from the corporate office. They pinged directly from the private network at Cameron's condominium. But IP addresses alone were not enough for a federal indictment. I needed absolute identification. I accessed the banking back-end security logs. Authorizing a transfer of that magnitude required two-factor authentication and biometric verification. I pulled the timestamps and cross-referenced them with the server access records. The logs showed clearly that the transfer was approved using a facial recognition scan linked directly to Cameron's mobile device. There was no hacking involved. There was no third-party breach. Cameron executed the trades himself, and the digital fingerprint he left was undeniable. I spent the next 4 hours compiling every shred of evidence. I gathered the bank statements, the offshore wire routing numbers, the crypto exchange receipts, the IP logs, and the biometric authentication timestamps. I organized them into a comprehensive 200-page forensic dossier. I annotated every illegal transaction with strict reference codes matching federal embezzlement statutes. It was a masterpiece of financial prosecution. Then I added the final nail to their coffin. I downloaded the forged construction invoices Richard sent to my email, the exact documents he demanded I sign to cover up the missing funds. I attached those files to the dossier, clearly highlighting my father's written instructions, directing me to falsify the corporate tax returns. The evidence now implicated both the vice president for embezzlement and the chief executive officer for conspiracy to commit tax fraud. I opened my encrypted communication portal and navigated to the official whistleblower submission page for the Internal Revenue Service. I uploaded the entire 200-page dossier. I filled out the official declaration forms providing my credentials as a certified public accountant to ensure the submission received priority review. Next, I opened a secure line to the Federal Bureau of Investigation Financial Crimes Division. I submitted the identical package specifically flagging the wire fraud and the Cayman Islands Shell Company to guarantee a federal response. I clicked send. The progress bar hit 100%. The files were delivered. The digital trap was fully armed and permanently locked. There was no way to recall the documents. The federal government now possessed a perfect, irrefutable roadmap to my family's criminal enterprise. I closed the laptop, wiped the hard drive clean of my personal data, and packed it into my bag. I moved silently around the room, gathering the rest of my belongings. I folded my clothes, packed my toiletries, and ensured I left nothing of value behind. I zipped my suitcase shut. The sky outside the window was beginning to turn a pale purple. Dawn was approaching. I stood at the door holding my luggage handle. I walked back to the mahogany desk one last time. I took a blank silver USB drive from my pocket. It contained a read-only copy of the exact dossier I had just sent to the federal agents. I placed it gently in the center of the desk, right next to a small yellow sticky note. I grabbed my bags, walked out of the room, and closed the door forever. At exactly 7 in the morning, heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway of the West Wing. Richard marched toward my bedroom door, holding a steaming cup of black coffee in one hand and his smartphone in the other. He did not bother to knock. He simply raised his foot and kicked the solid oak door open, expecting to find a broken, defeated daughter huddled under the covers. He stepped over the threshold with a triumphant sneer plastered across his face, ready to relish in his victory. "Finally learned your place," he barked, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet space. "I told you what happens when you cross me. Now hand over the signed audit forms so we can put this ugly little incident behind us." He stopped dead in his tracks. The smug expression slid off his face, replaced by a mask of sheer confusion. The bedroom was completely immaculate. The heavy duvet on the four-poster bed was neatly folded and tucked. The expensive decorative pillows sat perfectly arranged, completely untouched by human weight. He spun around, dropping his coffee cup a fraction of an inch as hot liquid splashed onto his knuckles. He ignored the burn, taking a rapid step toward the walk-in closet. He yanked the louvered doors wide open. The closet was completely empty. The hangers hung bare and silent. Every single piece of my clothing, every pair of shoes, every bag I had brought with me to the estate was gone. The space echoed with a terrifying, hollow finality. Richard stumbled backward, his breathing suddenly turning shallow and erratic. His eyes darted around the pristine bedroom, searching desperately for any sign of my presence, any indication that I was just hiding in the bathroom or out for a morning run. But the sterile emptiness of the room provided the absolute answer. I was gone. His gaze swept across the room and finally landed on the heavy mahogany desk positioned near the bay window. Sitting dead center on the polished wood surface was a single silver USB flash drive. Next to the drive lay a bright yellow sticky note. The vibrant color stood out like a warning beacon against the dark wood. Richard practically lunged across the room, his dress shoes slipping slightly on the hardwood floor. He snatched the sticky note, his fingers trembling as he brought it up to his face. The message was written in my precise, clean handwriting. It read, "I apologized." but to the Internal Revenue Service for covering for your sheer incompetence for so long. Enjoy the audit. A harsh, choked sound escaped Richard's throat. His chest heaved as he began to physically hyperventilate. The coffee cup slipped from his grasp, entirely shattering against the floorboards and sending a dark stain spreading across the expensive vintage rug. He did not even look down. He grabbed the silver USB drive, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped it. He sprinted out of the bedroom and ran down the hallway toward his private study, his breathing ragged and loud in the silent house. He burst into the study and slammed the door shut. He threw himself into his high-backed leather executive chair and flipped open his laptop. He jammed the USB drive into the port, his manicured fingers slipping on the keyboard as he typed his password. A prompt appeared on the screen indicating a read-only file. He clicked open the folder. The screen illuminated his pale, terrified face. Right there, perfectly organized and meticulously indexed, was the 200-page forensic dossier. He opened the master file. The header proudly displayed the official submission confirmation receipts from both the Federal Bureau of Investigation Financial Crimes Division and the Internal Revenue Service whistleblower portal. The timestamps showed the upload had been completed hours ago. It was far too late to stop it, far too late to hack it, and far too late to call in favors. Richard scrolled frantically through the documents. His eyes widened as he saw the raw transaction logs exposing Cameron moving $2.5 million out of the corporate operating account. He gasped as he saw the tracing maps linking the funds to the Cayman Islands shell company. He let out a strangled cry when he saw the biometric login timestamps directly tying the transfers to Cameron's personal gaming computer and mobile device. The digital proof was absolutely airtight. It was a flawless roadmap to a federal indictment. Then he scrolled down to the final section. The screen displayed the fake construction invoices he had personally emailed to me just hours prior. Attached directly below them were his own emails complete with his digital signature explicitly demanding that I falsify the tax returns to cover the missing money. I had handed the federal authorities direct proof of his conspiracy to commit tax fraud wrapped with a neat bow. He gripped the edges of the heavy oak desk, his knuckles turning completely white. He tried to take a deep breath, but the air felt thin and useless. The walls of his luxurious study suddenly felt like a prison cell closing in around him. He had spent his entire life bullying people into submission, using his wealth and influence to crush anyone who dared to stand in his way. He had assumed I was just another weak link he could easily manipulate. He had profoundly miscalculated. He frantically grabbed his cell phone from his pocket. He needed to warn Cameron. He needed to start moving assets immediately to minimize the inevitable financial devastation. He dialed his son's number, but his fingers were slipping so badly on the glass screen that he dropped the device onto the floor. He cursed loudly, diving under the desk to retrieve it. His perfect, controlled world was shattering into a million irreparable pieces. The reality of the situation crashed down on his shoulders with the weight of a freight train. He was facing decades in a federal prison. Before Richard could even open his mouth to scream for Cameron, the piercing sound of tires screeching violently against the asphalt driveway shattered the morning quiet. The heavy tires of a luxury sedan tore through the manicured front lawn, crushing the expensive flower beds my mother meticulously maintained. Richard scrambled out from under the heavy mahogany desk, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He rushed to the bay window, practically pressing his face against the cold glass to see who was destroying his property. A sleek black town car sat parked at an aggressive angle across the walkway. The driver's side door flew open, and Mr. Gallagher threw himself out of the vehicle. Gallagher was the ruthless corporate attorney who had protected my father for decades. He was a man known throughout the city for his icy demeanor, his impeccably tailored suits, and his terrifying ability to make any legal problem quietly disappear. But the man sprinting across the lawn right now did not look like a high-powered legal shark. He looked like a man running for his life. Gallagher was sweating profusely, beads of moisture glistening on his forehead despite the crisp morning air. His expensive silk tie was yanked loose, hanging crookedly around his neck. He had completely bypassed the intercom system, bypassing the formal entryway, and was currently pounding his fists against the heavy front doors, with the frantic energy of someone trying to escape a burning building. Richard abandoned his laptop and sprinted out of the study, racing down the grand staircase. He yanked the front door open, ready to demand an explanation for the property damage. He did not get the chance to speak a single word. Gallagher barged past him, shoving his way into the grand foyer. He dropped his heavy leather briefcase onto the marble floor and spun around to face my father. His breathing was heavy and ragged, his chest heaving as he pointed an accusatory finger directly at Richard. "Sir, what have you done?" Gallagher yelled, his voice cracking with absolute panic. "What the hell did you do?" Richard took a step back, stunned by the unprecedented display of insubordination from his usually stoic employee. "Keep your voice down," Richard demanded, his own panic bleeding through his false bravado. "I did not do anything. Olivia just staged some sort of digital coup. I was just about to call you to fix it." "Fix it!" Gallagher repeated, his voice escalating into a hysterical shriek. "You cannot fix this, Richard. You cannot buy your way out of this one. We are dealing with an absolute catastrophe." Gallagher dropped to his knees, frantically unsnapping the brass locks on his briefcase. He pulled out his laptop, flipped the screen open, and thrust it toward my father. The screen was filled with bright red banners and severe warning notifications from the corporate banking portal. "Look at this," Gallagher ordered, his finger tapping aggressively against the glass screen. "Look at the timestamp. As of exactly 7:01 this morning, we were locked out. Every single corporate bank account has been entirely frozen by a federal court order." Richard stared at the screen, the color completely draining from his face. "Frozen." He repeated the word, sounding hollow and weak. "What do you mean, frozen? We have hundreds of millions in liquid assets. You are the company lawyer. Call the bank president. Call the regional director. Tell them to lift the hold immediately." Gallagher let out a dark, manic laugh. "There is no one to call, Richard. The bank president cannot do a thing. This is not an internal security hold. This is a direct mandate from the United States federal government. The Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation filed an emergency ex parte motion before a federal judge at 6 in the morning. By 7:01, the judge signed the order. Every single operational fund we possess is gone." Richard stumbled backward until his legs hit a velvet bench in the foyer. He collapsed onto it, unable to support his own weight. "The corporate funds," he whispered. "We have payroll tomorrow. We have contractor payments due by noon." "Payroll is blocked," Gallagher stated ruthlessly, delivering the blows one by one. "The corporate credit cards are already declining. I found out because my retainers bounced. Then I tried to pay for a coffee on the way here using my executive expense card, and it was declined for fraudulent activity. The vendors are going to start calling in an hour. The construction crews are going to walk off the job sites by lunch. We cannot pay a single employee. We cannot pay for a single shipment of materials. The company is completely financially paralyzed. But we have the personal accounts," Richard stammered, grasping at straws. "The trusts, the offshore safety nets. We can bridge the gap. We can float the company until I get this sorted out. I will just transfer the funds from the family holdings." "You are not listening to me," Gallagher yelled, slamming the laptop shut. "The federal agents did not just target the corporate entity. They targeted you. They targeted Cameron. Every personal blind trust associated with your Social Security numbers has been locked down. They froze the estate accounts. They froze the Cayman holdings. They tracked every single digital footprint you left behind. You cannot access a single penny. You cannot even buy a tank of gas right now." Richard sat completely immobilized. The reality of his absolute destruction was finally taking hold. He had spent his entire life building an empire on intimidation and dirty money, believing he was untouchable. Now, in the span of a single minute, he was functionally bankrupt. The federal government had seized his entire existence. "How did they move this fast?" Richard asked, his voice barely a whisper. Government bureaucracy takes months. It takes years to freeze assets of this magnitude, not when they receive the flawless proof. Not when they receive the flawless proof. Gallagher finished his grim explanation, his voice trembling as he looked at the devastated patriarch. Before Richard could formulate a coherent response to the absolute destruction of his empire, a heavy dragging sound echoed from the grand staircase. Cameron stumbled down the carpeted steps, completely oblivious to the financial apocalypse unfolding in the foyer. He wore an expensive emerald green silk robe, loosely tied over his pajamas, rubbing his eyes with an exaggerated groan. His hair was perfectly tousled, the picture of a spoiled heir who had never faced a real consequence. "What is all this screaming about?" Cameron whined, dragging his leather slippers across the marble floor. "I was up late working on the high-rise proposals. I need absolute quiet in the mornings. And where is the housekeeper? I specifically asked for my double espresso 20 minutes ago. Are we paying these people to just stand around?" Right behind him, Cynthia glided down the staircase, tightening the belt of her cashmere dressing gown. Her face was covered in a thick, dark green clay mask, giving her the appearance of a wealthy swamp creature. "Richard, honestly," Cynthia complained, crossing her arms. "Cameron is right. The shouting is giving me a migraine. Tell Gallagher to take his legal drama back to the office so we can have a peaceful breakfast." Richard stared at his wife and his golden child. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He could not find the words to tell them that the chef, the housekeeper, and the entire estate staff were currently unpaid, that the house they were standing in was seized property, and that the millions of dollars they carelessly spent had just vanished into federal custody. Before Richard could force the devastating truth past his lips, a new sound shattered the suburban morning. It started as a distant, high-pitched wail, rapidly multiplying and growing deafeningly loud. The unmistakable shriek of multiple police sirens ripped through the affluent neighborhood, echoing off the sprawling mansions. Cameron froze, his complaints about the missing espresso dying in his throat. Cynthia touched her clay-covered cheek in confusion. Through the massive bay windows, they watched a terrifying scene unfold. The heavy wrought iron security gates at the end of the driveway did not simply open. They were violently rammed aside. 4 unmarked black SUVs roared onto the property, their tires tearing deep gashes into the pristine manicured lawn. They fishtailed across the wet grass and formed an aggressive blockade across the front entrance. 2 marked police cruisers followed closely behind, their red and blue lights flashing frantically, casting harsh, strobing shadows across the opulent interior of the foyer. The cruisers boxed in Gallagher's town car, ensuring absolutely no one could leave the estate. Armed federal agents in tactical gear poured out of the vehicles, swarming the perimeter of the mansion with terrifying militaristic precision. Cynthia let out a sharp, terrified shriek, instinctively stepping behind Cameron. Cameron just stood there, his jaw hanging open, looking like a deer caught in the headlights of a freight train. Richard took a step backward, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his rib cage. The heavy oak front door, custom built to keep the real world at bay, did not stand a chance. A massive steel-toed boot struck the wood right near the deadbolt. The door blasted open with a deafening crack, the frame splintering and sending wood shards flying across the expensive tile. Detective Ramirez strode into the grand foyer, completely ignoring the shattered door. He was flanked by 6 heavily armed federal agents, wearing jackets emblazoned with the letters FBI and IRS. Ramirez was a tall, imposing man with cold, unyielding eyes. He did not look at the expensive artwork on the walls or the crystal chandelier above. His gaze locked directly onto my father and my brother, Richard and Cameron. Ramirez announced, his voice booming with absolute, unquestionable authority. "You are currently under investigation for federal wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and criminal tax evasion. Do not move a single muscle." The words hit the room like a physical shockwave. Gallagher immediately backed away, putting his hands in the air to signal he was unarmed. Cynthia clutched her robe, her breath coming in panicked gasps. But Richard, blinded by decades of unchecked power, refused to accept his new reality. He puffed out his chest, trying to play the powerful CEO card one last time. He pointed a trembling finger at Detective Ramirez. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Richard shouted, his face turning crimson. "I am the largest real estate developer in this state. I play golf with the mayor. I fund police pension initiatives. You cannot just break into my home like a common street thug. I will have your badges for this. I will sue this entire department into bankruptcy." Ramirez did not blink. He simply reached to his tactical belt and pulled out a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. The metallic clink of the cuffs sounded loud as a gunshot. "You have the right to remain silent," Ramirez stated, his voice devoid of emotion. "I suggest you start utilizing it immediately, sir." Seeing the cold reality of the federal handcuffs shattered the illusion. The CEO persona vanished, leaving a terrified old man. But the most dramatic reaction came from the golden child. Cameron, the vice president, who yesterday believed he was a financial genius, completely collapsed. His knees gave out, sending him crashing onto the hard marble floor. The green silk robe pooled around him as he curled in on himself. He began sobbing immediately, giant heaving gasps echoing off the high ceilings. "Mom, do something." Cameron wailed, tears streaming down his face, abandoning any pretense of adulthood. "Tell them it is a mistake. Call the bank. Do not let them take me." Cynthia could only watch in horror as two federal agents stepped forward, grabbed her sobbing son by the arms, and hoisted him to his feet. The transition from the estate to the sterile environment of the federal holding facility was a brutal shock to their systems. The back of the armored transport vehicle smelled of stale sweat and industrial disinfectant, a sharp departure from the lavender and mahogany scent of their home. Richard sat rigidly on the metal bench, his hands bound tightly behind his back. The steel cuffs dug painfully into his wrists with every bump in the road. Across from him, Cameron wept uncontrollably, his emerald silk robe stained with dirt and tears. The golden child had completely unraveled his fragile ego, shattered by the harsh reality of law enforcement. Richard glared at his son in absolute disgust. He needed Cameron to pull himself together, but the boy was useless. When the transport finally lurched to a halt, heavily armed agents dragged them into the local precinct processing center. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a sickening, relentless hum. They were stripped of their belts, their designer watches, and their custom-tailored shoelaces. The booking officer processed them with mechanical indifference, utterly unimpressed by Richard shouting demands for a private suite. They were shoved into a concrete holding cell together. The heavy iron door slammed shut with a deafening clang that echoed through the bleak corridor. Inside the cell, the air was freezing. Cameron immediately curled into a pathetic ball on the hard metal bench, burying his face in his hands. He rocked back and forth, muttering nonsensical apologies to no one in particular. Richard ignored him entirely. He paced the narrow confines of the cell, his mind racing through 100 different damage control scenarios. He still refused to grasp the true magnitude of his situation. In his distorted reality, this was simply a massive misunderstanding, an overzealous bureaucratic error triggered by a missed deadline. He convinced himself that Olivia had simply run away in a petty tantrum and forgotten to file the routine extension forms. If he could just get her on the phone, he could fix this. He would scream at her, threaten her career, and force her to march down to the federal building and sort out the accounting errors. He approached the cell bars and yelled at the passing guard, demanding his legally mandated phone call. He shouted his demands with such venomous authority that the young deputy finally relented, leading him down a short hallway to a wall-mounted telephone. The receiver felt cheap and greasy against his ear. He punched in my phone number with aggressive, forceful strikes of his index finger, his jaw clenched tight. He rehearsed the exact threats he would use to break my spirit the moment I answered. He held the plastic receiver to his ear and listened to the electronic ringing tone. It rang once, it rang twice. Then Richard noticed something incredibly strange. The ringing was not just happening inside the earpiece. A crisp, distinct digital chime was echoing through the sterile hallway. The sound was coming from the observation room directly adjacent to the holding area. Richard froze his eyes, darting toward the large, tinted glass window embedded in the concrete wall. The ringing continued perfectly synchronized with the tone in his ear. Suddenly, the mechanical whir of an electric motor hummed to life. The heavy metal blinds covering the observation window began to slowly roll upward. The harsh fluorescent light from the hallway spilled into the darkened room beyond the glass. Richard dropped the phone receiver. It dangled from its metal cord, swinging back and forth. His breath hitched in his throat. Standing on the other side of the thick glass, bathed in the cool light of the observation room, was me. I was not hiding. I was not crying. I was not the terrified, submissive daughter he had bullied in the coat room 12 hours ago. I stood tall, dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, projecting absolute authority. I held a steaming cup of artisan coffee in my left hand, taking a slow, deliberate sip. Standing shoulder to shoulder with me was Detective Ramirez. The federal agent who had just kicked down my father's front door was treating me not as a suspect, but as a highly respected colleague. Ramirez looked at Richard with a mixture of pity and contempt, then turned his head to nod respectfully at me. In my right hand, I held my smartphone. The screen glowed brightly, displaying my father's incoming call. Richard stared at me through the thick glass, his eyes wide with a sudden, horrifying realization. He pressed his hands against the glass, his mouth moving as he tried to form a word, but his voice failed him. I looked directly into his panicked, bloodshot eyes. I did not glare. I did not gloat. I simply offered him a serene, chilling smile. I raised my phone so he could see the screen clearly. With one deliberate, fluid motion of my thumb, I swiped the red button. I declined the call. The ringing in the hallway stopped instantly. The silence that followed was absolute and heavy with consequence. In that single, soundless moment, the entire foundation of Richard's world collapsed. The psychological impact struck him with the force of a physical blow. The crushing truth finally penetrated his arrogance. I had not run away in fear. I had not made a clerical error. I was the architect of his absolute destruction. His quiet, obedient scapegoat daughter had meticulously engineered his downfall, handed his criminal empire to the federal government, and stood by to watch him fall. His knees buckled under the heavy weight of his agonizing realization. He slid slowly down the cold glass, leaving sweaty palm prints on the pane, completely defeated and utterly broken. He now finally knew he was facing a very long, very brutal prison sentence in a facility where his stolen wealth meant absolutely nothing. I simply lowered my phone, took another calm, slow sip of my dark roast coffee, and quietly enjoyed the truly beautiful view. The heavy metal door of the holding area swung open. Two uniformed officers gripped Richard by the arms and hauled him away from the observation glass. His legs barely functioned as they dragged him down the corridor and shoved him into an interrogation room. Cameron was sitting there trembling at a scratched table. A moment later, Gallagher marched into the room. The lawyer had managed to regain a fraction of his usual composure, though his collar remained unbuttoned and his breathing was shallow. He slammed his leather briefcase onto the table. The sharp noise made Cameron jump in his seat. Gallagher leaned over the table, staring directly into his face. He confirmed what my father already knew. I was the one who handed the forensic dossier to the federal agents. The initial shock quickly morphed into cornered desperation. Richard slammed his bound hands against the table, demanding a way out. He refused to spend his life in a federal penitentiary for a simple misstep. Gallagher breathed deeply, his mind shifting from panic to ruthless survival mode. He looked at Richard, then at the weeping Cameron, and finally laid out a truly sinister strategy. If they wanted to survive the day, they needed to completely flip the narrative. They needed to stop playing defense and go on the attack. The federal agents had my report, but an audit report was just a collection of numbers. Gallagher insisted that numbers could be challenged. He proposed they double down on their toxic dynamic. They would use my position against me. Gallagher paced the small room, outlining the fabricated story with cold precision. I was the lead internal auditor. That meant I possessed the highest level of administrative access to the corporate servers. I knew the security protocols. I knew the offshore routing numbers. Gallagher told Richard they must convince the detectives that I was the actual mastermind behind the embezzlement. According to this twisted narrative, I was the one who stole the $2.5 million. I wired the funds to the Cayman Islands shell company and dumped the cash into the cryptocurrency exchange. But I needed a fall guy, so I deliberately framed my brother. Cameron wiped his nose slowly, looking up as he realized his lawyer was handing him a lifeline. Richard nodded eagerly, grasping at the malicious lie. They began fleshing out the details of my supposed betrayal. They decided to lean heavily into the family drama from the previous night. Gallagher noted that multiple high-net-worth guests had witnessed the argument at the gala. They had all seen Richard publicly discipline me. The lawyer instructed my father to use that incident as my motive. I was a bitter, deeply jealous sister who had always resented his success. The public grounding was simply the final insult that caused me to snap. Driven by sheer rage and professional envy, I executed a flawless corporate heist and pointed all the digital evidence directly at the golden child. It was a perfectly disgusting lie designed to exploit every stereotype of a disgruntled, unstable employee. Cameron immediately embraced his new role. The genuine terror he felt about going to prison seamlessly transitioned into a performance of profound betrayal. He sat up straighter, practicing his lines for the lawyer. He would tell the police that he had noticed discrepancies in the accounts for weeks. He would claim he had planned to bring them to the board, but his sister found out and initiated the frame job before he could act. Richard coached him, telling him to play up the emotional angle. He needed to act like a heartbroken brother whose own flesh and blood had destroyed him out of spite. They spent the next 20 minutes coordinating their stories, making sure their timelines aligned perfectly. They ignored the fact that my evidence was incredibly thorough. In their arrogance, they believed their wealth and social standing would automatically make their word credible. They were wealthy white-collar executives, and I was just an angry daughter throwing a fit. The door handle clicked. Gallagher immediately motioned for Cameron to start crying again. The golden child buried his face in his hands, squeezing out tears on cue. Richard sat back, arranging his features into a mask of stoic sorrow. The door swung open, and Detective Ramirez stepped into the room. He carried a thick manila folder under his arm and looked at the three men with absolute disdain. He pulled out a metal chair and sat down across from them, waiting for someone to speak. Gallagher wasted no time. He went straight on the offensive, slapping his hand onto the aluminum table. He looked Ramirez square in the eye and demanded my immediate arrest. He confidently declared that his clients were the victims of a sophisticated corporate coup. The lawyer pitched their entire fabricated story without a flinch. He claimed I had embezzled the funds, manipulated the server logs to implicate Cameron, and then called the authorities myself to cover my tracks. Cameron let out a loud, theatrical sob. He looked at the detective with wide, tear-filled eyes, claiming I was deeply unstable. He said I had always been jealous of his position in the company, and that the confrontation at the gala proved I was holding a dangerous grudge. Richard chimed in, using his deep, authoritative voice to validate the lie. He told Ramirez that I had a history of erratic behavior and that my actions were a tragic, desperate attempt to destroy the family out of sheer malice. Gallagher leaned forward, demanding that the frozen assets be released immediately. He insisted that the federal agents were being manipulated by a deranged, vindictive employee. He demanded that Ramirez march into the observation room, put me in handcuffs, and charge me with grand larceny and corporate sabotage. They sat back, fully expecting the detective to apologize for the misunderstanding and rush to arrest me. They genuinely believed their toxic performance was absolutely and completely flawless. Detective Ramirez listened to their entire fabricated performance without a single change in his expression. He let the heavy silence stretch across the cold interrogation room, allowing the three men to steep in their own staggering arrogance. Gallagher sat back, clearly expecting the federal agent to immediately dispatch officers to arrest me. Cameron sniffled, wiping away fake tears with the sleeve of his expensive silk robe. Richard maintained his mask of profound paternal disappointment, shaking his head as if mourning the loss of his daughter to total madness. Ramirez finally leaned forward, resting his forearms on the scratched metal table. He looked at Gallagher, then at Richard, and finally at Cameron. He did not reach for his radio. He did not issue any orders for my arrest. Instead, he slowly stood up, his heavy tactical boots scraping loudly against the bare concrete floor. He walked over to the heavy metal door, grasped the handle, and pulled it wide open. He stepped aside, gesturing into the brightly lit hallway. "You can come in now," Ramirez said flatly. My father shifted in his seat, his brow furrowing in sudden confusion. He expected another detective or a federal prosecutor to walk inside. He absolutely did not expect me. I stepped through this doorway, my navy blue suit perfectly pressed, carrying a thick manila folder and my encrypted tablet. The atmosphere in the interrogation room changed instantly. The smug satisfaction completely vanished from my father's face, replaced by a flash of genuine panic. Cameron physically recoiled, pressing his back against the cinder-block wall as if trying to merge with it. Gallagher jumped to his feet, his chair screeching backward. He immediately began protesting, demanding to know why a suspect was being allowed into the room with his clients. Ramirez calmly instructed the lawyer to sit down and remain completely silent unless spoken to. I walked over to the table and stood directly across from my father. I did not break eye contact. I did not fidget. I stood with the absolute certainty of a woman who held every single card in the deck. Richard realized his scapegoat strategy was crumbling, so he decided to double down on his emotional manipulation. He looked at me with an expression of feigned heartbreak, his eyes wide and pleading. He was banking on my lifelong habit of backing down to avoid any family conflict. "Olivia, how could you do this to your own brother?" Richard asked, his voice trembling with manufactured sorrow. "How could you destroy everything we built out of petty jealousy? Just confess to the police right now, and we will get you the psychiatric help you so desperately need. We can still fix this, sweetheart. You are clearly not in your right mind." It was the exact same tactic he had used my entire life. Whenever I raised a valid concern or pointed out Cameron's failures, Richard would immediately deflect by questioning my mental stability. He would call me dramatic, overly sensitive, or hysterical. He had conditioned me to second-guess my own reality. He fully expected me to lower my head, apologize for causing trouble, and take the blame just to make the yelling stop. But the woman standing in front of him was no longer his obedient punching bag. I did not flinch. I did not cry. I looked at his pathetic, manipulative performance with a deadpan expression. "I am completely in my right mind, Richard," I said, my voice carrying zero emotion, "and I do not need your psychiatric help. What you need is a miracle." I placed my tablet onto the table. Then, with a loud, resounding thud, I dropped the massive 200-page stack of physical forensic evidence directly in front of him. The sound echoed through the small concrete room like a judge's gavel. The thick binder was filled with highlighted bank statements, wire transfer logs, printed emails, and digital security signatures. Gallagher stared at the enormous pile of documents, his professional bravado melting into sheer terror. He recognized the sheer volume of data required to build a binder that thick. He knew instantly that this was not the work of an erratic, jealous sister making baseless accusations. This was a fully prepared, legally airtight prosecution package. Richard stared at the binder, his fake heartbreak completely evaporating. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. "What is this?" he demanded, trying to inject some authority back into his voice. It sounded weak and hollow. "This is the reality of your situation," I replied, tapping the cover of the binder. "This is every single transaction, every hidden account, and every forged document you and your golden child tried to use to cover up your crimes. I am not the suspect here, Richard. I am the lead witness for the federal government." Cameron let out a whimpering sound, pulling his silk robe tighter around his trembling shoulders. He looked at the binder as if it were a venomous snake about to strike. "Dad, tell them she is lying," Cameron pleaded, his voice cracking. "Tell them she made it all up. She hacked my computer. She stole my passwords. She set me up. I slowly turned my gaze to my brother. You really should have paid more attention when I explained my job to you, Cameron. I do not just look at spreadsheets. I reconstruct digital financial crimes. I know exactly how to prove who pressed the button. I opened my tablet and tapped the screen, bringing up the biometric login data. You claimed I framed you. You claimed I stole your passwords. But passwords can be stolen. Facial recognition scans cannot. The air in the room grew heavy and stagnant. Gallagher put his head in his hands, realizing the fatal flaw in their fabricated story. They had tried to pin a complex digital crime on a senior forensic accountant. It was like trying to teach a fish how to drown. They had severely underestimated my absolute unyielding professional capabilities entirely. I opened the thick binder resting on the scratched metal table and flipped to the first tab. The heavy paper rustled loudly in the suffocating silence of the interrogation room. I slid a highly detailed network tracking report directly across the table toward Detective Ramirez, making sure it was positioned where my brother could see the highlighted sections. You told the detectives that I hacked your computer, Cameron, I said, keeping my voice entirely devoid of emotion. You claimed I stole your passwords and executed the wire transfers from my own device to frame you, but the network logs tell a completely different story. I pointed to a specific string of numbers printed in bold red ink. This is the exact IP address that initiated the $2.5 million transfer from the corporate operating account. It did not originate from the company headquarters, and it certainly did not come from my personal laptop. This IP address belongs to the private secure network installed at your luxury condominium. Furthermore, I pulled the hardware identification logs. The device that executed these trades possesses a highly specific media access control address. I looked directly into his panicked eyes. It is the exact hardware address of your custom-built liquid-cooled gaming PC, the same computer you brag about building yourself. Unless you are suggesting I broke into your heavily secured apartment, bypassed your alarm system, booted up your personal gaming rig, and guessed your encryption keys, your story is physically impossible. The transaction was initiated by you sitting at your own desk. Cameron sank lower into his chair, his mouth opening and closing as he desperately searched for another lie to spin. He found nothing. I turned my attention away from his pathetic display and focused my cold gaze entirely on my father. Richard sat rigidly, his jaw clenched, still trying to project an aura of untouchable authority. He thought he could outsmart the digital evidence. He was incredibly wrong. I turned to the second tab in the enormous forensic binder and extracted a stack of offshore banking authorizations. I pushed them across the table. You claimed I acted completely alone, Richard. I stated, my voice echoing off the concrete walls. You told the police that I funneled the stolen funds into a Cayman Islands shell company out of spite. But establishing that specific offshore entity and authorizing the final wire transfer required top-tier executive clearance. It required the chief executive officer to personally verify the movement of funds. I tapped my manicured fingernail against the final page of the document stack. It displayed a detailed digital security audit provided directly by the corporate banking platform. The bank requires biometric two-factor authentication for any overseas transfer exceeding $1 million. This log proves that the transfer to the Cayman Shell Corporation was authorized at exactly 11:14 at night. The authentication protocol used was an Apple Face ID scan. The device registered during that scan was your personal company-issued smartphone. I leaned forward, resting my hands firmly on the metal table. You cannot fake a biometric facial scan, Richard. You held your phone up to your face and personally approved the transfer of stolen money to cover your son's catastrophic failure. You are legally bound to that transaction. There is absolutely no plausible deniability. My father stared at the biometric authentication logs, as if the pages had suddenly caught fire. The last remaining shreds of his corporate invincibility burned away into nothing. His breathing grew shallow and rapid. He looked at Gallagher for a lifeline, but the ruthless attorney was completely silent, his eyes glued to the flawless forensic evidence spread across the table. The room was tense, but I was not finished dismantling their lies. I had one final piece of evidence to present, the ultimate weapon that would permanently obliterate their entire fabricated narrative. I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I unlocked the screen and opened my audio recording application. "You told Detective Ramirez that I was an unstable, disgruntled employee acting out of sheer malice," I said softly. "You told him that my actions were a tragic attempt to destroy this family out of petty jealousy over being grounded. Let us hear exactly what happened when you dragged me into that private coat room last night." I placed the phone in the center of the table and pressed play. The high-quality audio file began to play perfectly clearly in the quiet interrogation room. Cameron's voice echoed from the small speaker, frantic and whiny. He admitted losing the $2.5 million in a cryptocurrency scam. Then my father's voice boomed from the device, harsh and threatening. The recording captured every single word of his illegal demands. It played his explicit instructions to classify the missing funds as emergency construction materials. It broadcast his vicious threats to destroy my career, revoke my certified public accountant license, and throw me out on the street if I refused to forge the internal audit documents. The audio recording ended with the sharp sound of the courtroom door unlocking. I reached forward and calmly turned off my phone screen. The oppressive silence that immediately followed was absolutely deafening. Detective Ramirez sat back in his metal chair, nodding slowly as the sheer gravity of the criminal conspiracy settled over the room. He looked at the two men with undisguised professional disgust. Mr. Gallagher physically slumped in his chair, his shoulders dropping as if a heavy physical weight had crushed his spine. The corporate attorney looked at the mountain of irrefutable forensic evidence, then at the undeniable biometric logs, and finally at the damning audio recording. His expensive legal strategies had been completely annihilated by pure data. He slowly turned his heavy head to look at his wealthy, arrogant client. Gallagher leaned directly close to my father, his face slick with sweat. He did not yell. He did not offer any false hope or legal loopholes. Gallagher simply stared into my father's terrified eyes and whispered, "You are going to prison." I exited the interrogation room, leaving the three men to suffocate in the harsh reality of their immediate future. The heavy metal door clicked shut behind me, sealing their fate. I took a deep breath of the sterile precinct air, feeling a profound sense of clarity. Detective Ramirez remained inside to formally process their federal charges. I walked down the narrow concrete corridor toward the main lobby, ready to finalize my statement at the front desk. Before I could even reach the swinging double doors, a shrill, piercing scream shattered the quiet atmosphere of the police station. "Olivia!" The frantic voice echoed off the cinder-block walls, bouncing violently through the enclosed space. It was my mother. Cynthia had somehow bypassed the initial security checkpoint at the front entrance, completely ignoring the desk sergeant who was shouting for her to stop. She marched down the restricted hallway, her designer coat flapping wildly behind her. Her perfectly styled hair was a disheveled mess, and her face was flushed with absolute unfiltered rage. She spotted me standing near the vending machines and charged forward like a wounded animal seeking a target. She cornered me against the cold, painted brick wall, her eyes wide and manic. She grabbed my forearm, her fingernails digging painfully into the fabric of my jacket. She did not ask if I was okay. She did not ask what the federal agents had found. She immediately launched into a vicious, emotional assault designed to break my resolve. "How could you do this to us?" Cynthia hissed, her voice trembling with synthetic heartbreak. "We are your blood. You are deliberately destroying this entire family over a petty grudge. You are sending your own father and your brother to jail because you were embarrassed at a dinner party. Tell the police you made a mistake right now. You march back in there and fix this before the media gets hold of the story." I looked down at her hand, clutching my arm, and then looked directly into her frantic eyes. I did not pull away. I did not raise my voice to match her hysterical tone. I simply stood there, projecting the same cold, calculating energy I had used to dismantle her husband. "I am not fixing anything, Cynthia," I stated evenly. "They committed federal wire fraud. They stole millions. I simply handed the government the receipts. The destruction of this family is entirely their own doing. Cynthia let go of my arm, taking a step back as if I had physically struck her. Her sorrow instantly evaporated, replaced by a dark, vindictive fury. She realized playing the heartbroken mother was not going to work, so she quickly pivoted to her favorite weapon: financial manipulation. If you do not walk into that room and drop these absurd charges right this second, you will lose everything, she threatened, her voice dropping to a dangerous snarl. I will call the estate attorneys myself. I will personally write you out of the family will. You will not receive a single dime of the inheritance. You will be completely disowned and left with absolutely nothing. She crossed her arms across her chest, lifting her chin in a gesture of supreme arrogance. She truly believed that the threat of losing her money would bring me to my knees. She thought I was still the obedient little girl who desperately craved her financial approval. I let out a soft, humorless laugh that made her flinch. You cannot disown me from money that the federal government is currently seizing, Cynthia, I replied, my tone dangerously calm. But since we are discussing corporate finances, let us talk about your personal expenditures. I took a step forward, invading her personal space just as my father had done to me the night before. I leaned in close until I could smell the expensive floral perfume radiating from her designer coat. I lowered my voice to a sharp, precise whisper, ensuring that only she could hear the absolute devastation I was about to unleash. You think you are innocent in all of this just because Cameron pressed the button, I asked quietly. Did you really think an internal auditor tracking $2.5 million would simply ignore the other glaring discrepancies in the corporate ledger? Cynthia froze her eyes, darting nervously. I continued my surgical strike. I tracked your mysterious company expense report, Cynthia. I know exactly how you utilized the corporate credit accounts over the past 4 years. I traced the unauthorized purchases directly to a luxury jeweler downtown. You used $150,000 of company operational funds to buy diamond necklaces and platinum bracelets. You submitted the forged receipts to the accounting department and fraudulently claimed those diamonds as office staging decorations for our commercial real estate properties. You committed embezzlement to fund your vanity. Her jaw dropped open. All the color rapidly drained from her face, leaving her looking entirely ghostly and hollow under the harsh fluorescent lights. She tried to formulate a denial, but her vocal cords completely failed her. She knew that I possessed the exact receipts, the specific tracking numbers, and the undeniable proof of her luxury theft. I leaned back, adjusting my navy blue suit jacket with a slow, methodical movement. I kept my gaze locked onto her terrified eyes. I submitted the primary dossier regarding Cameron and Richard this morning, I stated with absolute finality. I am currently holding the secondary file containing your fraudulent diamond purchases. If you ever threaten me again, or if you do not back off right this very second, I will hand your file directly to Detective Ramirez. You will be sitting in the concrete holding cell right next to your husband before lunch. Cynthia stood completely paralyzed. The arrogant matriarch was entirely broken by the cold, hard data. She went pale and fell silent. I turned around and walked away, leaving her suffocating in fear. I walked out of the precinct, the crisp afternoon air finally clearing the suffocating stench of desperation my mother had left behind in the hallway. Behind those thick concrete walls, the reality of the federal justice system was actively processing my family. Despite the overwhelming mountain of forensic evidence I had provided, money still spoke volumes in this city. Mr. Gallagher, acting on pure survival instinct, managed to pull off one final desperate legal maneuver. By leveraging the very last of my father's uncontaminated real estate holdings, completely unencumbered assets that predated the corporate fraud, the lawyer secured a massive bail package. Richard and Cameron were granted temporary release pending their official arraignment. They walked out the back exit of the police station, stripped of their dignity and public standing, but physically free for the moment. Cameron did not wait for our father. He practically sprinted to a waiting town car, leaving Richard standing alone on the sidewalk. The golden child was entirely consumed by a blinding absolute panic. The drive back to his luxury condominium was a terrifying blur of hyperventilation and cold sweats. The reality of a federal indictment for wire fraud and embezzlement carried a minimum mandatory sentence of 10 years. 10 years in a federal penitentiary. The very thought made him physically ill. He was a pampered executive who required thread count specific sheets and imported espresso every morning. He had never faced a genuine hardship in his entire 35 years of existence. Prison would not just break him, prison would completely annihilate him. He stumbled through the grand lobby of his building, completely ignoring the concerned look of the concierge, and rode the private elevator up to his penthouse suite. He unlocked the heavy mahogany door and immediately rushed down the hallway toward his private study. His hands shook violently as he grabbed a large leather duffel bag from the top shelf of his closet. He threw it onto the floor and began tossing items inside with zero regard for organization. He shoved in stacks of emergency cash from his hidden wall safe, a handful of designer watches that could easily be fenced, and most importantly, his collection of passports. Cameron had always been incredibly paranoid, maintaining dual citizenship just in case the corporate world ever turned sour. His escape plan quickly crystallized in his frantic racing mind. He needed to reach a private airstrip immediately. He needed to charter an untraceable flight to a jurisdiction with absolutely no extradition treaty with the United States. A place where his father's ruined name and the FBI's reach meant nothing. He knew the federal agents would likely seize his passport and ground him by morning, but right now he possessed a small, crucial window of opportunity. The government moved fast today, but bureaucratic processing for international flight restrictions often lagged by a few vital hours. He just needed to secure a flight before the system updated. However, running required untraceable liquid cash. Flight charters out of the country demanded massive upfront payments, usually in international wires that cleared instantly. Cameron pulled out his personal smartphone and aggressively tapped the screen, logging into his various banking applications. Error messages flashed across his screen in bright, glaring red text. Every single personal account, joint account, and hidden emergency fund tied to his Social Security number remained completely locked under the federal freeze. He cursed loudly, slamming his fist against the solid wood desk. The money he had hoarded over the years was utterly useless to him now. He was a millionaire on paper, but functionally bankrupt in reality. The federal government had built an impenetrable wall around his finances, anticipating his exact flight risk profile. He paced the room, his breathing growing ragged as the walls of the study seemed to close in around him. He needed cash right this second, or he was going to spend the next decade in a concrete box. Then his frantic eyes landed on a different application folder on his phone. A slick, wicked idea formed in his desperate brain. He thought about his wife. Nia was not named in the federal indictments. Her luxury salon franchise was an entirely separate legal entity built completely through her own hard work and sheer grit. She had meticulously kept her business finances isolated from his real estate firm. That meant her accounts were clean. Her money was unfrozen. Cameron knew she maintained a substantial emergency operating fund to manage payroll and expansion costs for her salons. There was over $300,000 sitting perfectly safe in a high-yield business savings account, untouched by the morning raid. Cameron viewed her hard-earned capital not as her life work, but as his ultimate safety net. He felt absolutely zero guilt about the prospect of completely stealing it from her. In his twisted, entitled mind, she owed this money to the family. He convinced himself that he had elevated her social status by marrying her, providing her with elite connections she never could have secured on her own, and now it was simply her turn to pay the necessary toll. He rushed out of the study and headed straight for the master bedroom, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. He knew exactly where she kept her physical banking tokens and encrypted hardware wallets. He tore through her velvet jewelry boxes and locked personal drawers, throwing her delicate necklaces and rings onto the hardwood floor until his shaking fingers brushed against the cold metal tokens. He gripped them tightly in his palm, a manic, desperate smile spreading across his pale, sweaty face. He grabbed his smartphone and initiated the transfer protocol. He began entering the codes, fully preparing to drain her entire business clean. He was ready to leave the woman he supposedly loved with absolutely nothing, perfectly willing to destroy her entire future just to save his own cowardly skin. He did not hear the front door of the penthouse click open. He did not hear the soft, deliberate footsteps echoing down the long, marble corridor. He was entirely consumed by the glowing screen of his device, his thumb hovering over the final transfer authorization field. The heavy mahogany door to the master suite was already ajar. Nia stepped into the room, stopping dead in her tracks as her eyes swept over the absolute chaos. Her designer clothes were scattered across the floor like discarded rags. Her velvet jewelry boxes were overturned, their contents spilling across the vanity. And standing in the center of the wreckage was her husband, clutching her proprietary banking hardware. "What exactly do you think you are doing?" Nia asked, her voice slicing through the heavy air of the bedroom like a freshly sharpened blade. Cameron jumped his shoulder, hitting the edge of the mirror. He spun around his chest, heaving his face pale and slick with panicked sweat. For a split second, he tried to force his signature charming smile onto his face, attempting to play the role of the loving partner. But the facade immediately crumbled under the intense, furious glare of his wife. "Naya, thank God you are here," Cameron gasped, taking a step toward her. He aggressively waved the metal tokens in her direction. "You have to unlock these right now. The federal government froze my accounts. My father and I barely managed to post bail, but we are completely exposed. I need $300,000 in liquid cash to secure a private charter out of the country tonight. You need to authorize this transfer immediately before the banks close the international processing window." Nia stood absolutely perfectly still. She looked at the frantic, pathetic man standing in the wreckage of her bedroom. She processed the magnitude of his request in a fraction of a second. He was not asking for a temporary loan to hire a defense attorney. He was packing bags. He was attempting to drain her entirely separate, hard-earned business capital to fund a cowardly escape. He was planning to leave her to face the devastating fallout of his criminal actions alone. "Put my security tokens down on the vanity," Cameron, Nia instructed, maintaining absolute, unwavering composure. "You are not touching a single dime of my salon revenue." The panic in Cameron instantly morphed into a vicious, ugly rage. He lunged forward, closing the distance between them. "You do not understand the severity of this situation," he shouted, his face contorting with anger. "I am facing 10 years in a federal penitentiary because of my psychotic sister. I am your husband. What is yours is mine. I need that money to save my life. Give me the bypass codes right now." Nia did not flinch or retreat. She tilted her chin up, radiating unyielding strength. "I built that business from the ground up while you played pretend executive at your father company," she replied coldly. "I worked 16-hour shifts. I swept floors. I balanced ledgers. You will not steal my life work to run away like a coward." Cameron completely lost whatever thin grip he had left on his sanity. He resorted to the vilest, most elitist insults he could weaponize. "You owe me," he snarled, his voice dripping with absolute venom. "You owe this entire family, Nia. Do you really think you built that little beauty parlor empire all on your own? We elevated your status. Before you married a prestigious name, you were just another nobody from a working-class neighborhood. My family gave you connections. We gave you respectability. My mother tolerated your presence at our dinner table. You owe us for lifting you out of the gutter, so you are going to hand over the money." The sheer audacity of his racist, elitist tirade hung heavily in the suffocating air of the bedroom. Cameron fully expected his vicious words to break her down. He expected her to crumble into tears, overwhelmed by the harsh reminders of his mother and her relentless, passive-aggressive cruelty. He anticipated immediate submission. Nia did not shed a single tear. The years of biting her tongue during Cynthia and her backhanded compliments about her hair, the countless times she ignored Cameron and his financial ineptitude, and the exhausting burden of playing the grateful daughter-in-law all culminated in this exact moment. She looked at the trembling man standing before her, and she felt absolutely nothing but profound, liberating disgust. Without a word of warning, Nia stepped forward and delivered a devastating open-handed slap directly across Cameron's face. The sharp, explosive crack echoed off the vaulted ceiling. The physical impact was so forceful that Cameron staggered backward, dropping the banking tokens onto the hardwood floor. He clutched his stinging cheek, his eyes wide with absolute shock. He had never been struck in his entire pampered life. Before he could even register the pain, Nia swiftly bypassed him. She snatched her personal smartphone from the marble dresser. She raised the device to her face, allowing the biometric scanner to read her features. The screen unlocked instantly. Her fingers flew across the digital interface with practiced, flawless precision. She opened her primary banking application, navigated straight to the security settings, and initiated a total administrative lockdown. She froze every single operational account, transferred the primary balances into a heavily secured holding trust, and permanently disabled the physical tokens Cameron had dropped. She completed the entire defensive maneuver in under 10 seconds. The money was now completely inaccessible to anyone but her. She locked the phone and slipped it safely into the pocket of her tailored blazer. Cameron stared at her, his chest rising and falling rapidly. "What did you just do?" he gasped, panic entirely consuming him once again. Nia slowly looked down at the physical banking tokens scattered across the expensive hardwood floor. She glared directly at him. "You are nothing but a pathetic, spoiled little child." Nia turned on her heel and walked out of the master bedroom, leaving Cameron sobbing on the hardwood floor amidst the scattered designer clothes. She strode through the expansive condominium, the silence of the empty rooms suddenly feeling oppressive. The illusion of the family's immense wealth had completely shattered. For years, Cynthia and Richard had paraded their financial superiority, holding it over her head like a heavy crown. Cameron had played the part of the successful executive buying expensive cars and boasting about massive acquisitions. Now Nia realized it was all a fragile house of cards built on debt, lies, and corporate fraud. They were completely broke, and they were criminals. Furthermore, the narrative they had aggressively pushed about Olivia being the unstable and jealous sister was entirely false. Olivia had not thrown a petty tantrum at the gala. Olivia had executed a flawless financial takedown because she was the only competent professional in their corrupted bloodline. Nia descended in the private elevator, her mind calculating her next tactical move. She needed the complete truth, and there was only one person capable of providing the unfiltered data. She stepped out into the afternoon air, pulled her phone from her blazer pocket, and dialed my number. I was currently sitting at a small table inside an obscure diner on the outskirts of the city, watching the rain hit the window. When my phone screen illuminated with Nia name, I hesitated for a fraction of a second. I fully expected her to scream at me for sending federal agents to arrest her husband. I answered the call, preparing myself for a furious verbal assault. Instead, her voice came through the speaker, incredibly calm and terrifyingly sharp. She asked where I was located. I gave her the address of the diner. She told me to stay put and hung up the phone without another word. 30 minutes later, the bell above the diner door jingled loudly. Nia walked inside, her immaculate outfit contrasting sharply with the faded vinyl booths and sticky linoleum floors. She spotted me immediately and slid into the booth directly across from me. She did not yell. She did not cause a scene. A tired waitress approached our table holding a small notepad. Nia simply ordered a black coffee, refusing a menu. The waitress walked away, leaving us in a heavy, expectant silence. Nia folded her hands on the sticky table, looked me directly in the eye, and issued a simple, firm command. "Please tell me everything." I did not sugarcoat a single detail. I laid out the exact chronology of the corporate fraud, treating her with the professional respect she truly deserved. I explained how Cameron had recklessly bypassed company security protocols to wire $2.5 million of operating funds into a volatile cryptocurrency exchange. I detailed how the altcoin market crashed, wiping out the entire investment in a matter of days. I watched Nia's eyes narrow as she processed the sheer magnitude of his financial stupidity. I continued explaining how Richard had dragged me into the coat room and attempted to force me to sign forged internal audit documents. They wanted to classify the missing millions as emergency construction materials to fool the federal tax authorities. They threatened to destroy my career and evict me from the family estate if I refused to be their sacrificial lamb. I explained my midnight forensic investigation tracking the network logs and the biometric signatures straight back to Cameron personal devices. I told her about submitting the massive dossier to the federal agents ending their reign of terror. Nia picked up her black coffee and took a slow, deliberate sip. She did not defend her husband. She shook her head, a bitter smile touching her lips. He tried to drain my business accounts an hour ago. Nia revealed, her voice steady, but laced with profound disgust. He wanted to use the $300,000 I earned from my salon franchise to flee the country and avoid prison. He actually told me I owed the family my money as repayment for elevating my social status. I felt a surge of intense familiar anger on her behalf. They used you the exact same way they used me, I said quietly, leaning forward across the table. We bonded over the profound shared trauma of surviving their relentless psychological warfare. You were the outsider daughter-in-law they could constantly patronize and belittle to make themselves feel culturally superior. I was the scapegoat daughter they could easily blame for every single family failure. We were both just convenient punching bags for a group of deeply insecure, arrogant narcissists who fed on our humiliation. Nia slowly nodded, her expression hardening into absolute resolve. She saw the twisted family dynamic with perfect clarity now. Cynthia had spent years making passive-aggressive comments about Nia, her background, and her self-made business. Richard had treated her like an acquired asset rather than a human being. Cameron had used her stability as a safety net while secretly plunging their future into a massive criminal conspiracy. They had systematically isolated us both, making us feel inadequate so they could maintain absolute control over our lives. We sat there in the quiet diner, two women who had survived a toxic empire built on gaslighting and manipulation. The deep anger we both shared was not chaotic or loudly expressed. It was a very cold, highly focused energy. Nia looked at me, her dark eyes burning with a fierce, calculating intelligence. She realized that I had already dealt the fatal blow to their corporate structure, but she possessed the tools to finish the job entirely. The arrogant family had picked the very wrong targets, and their absolute complete destruction was only just beginning right now. We were no longer going to play their twisted games. We were going to dismantle their remaining power piece by piece, ensuring that neither of us would ever be victimized or treated like collateral damage again. Nia shifted her weight in the faded vinyl booth, her dark eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that commanded the entire space. The diner around us faded into background noise as she reached down to the sticky linoleum floor. When I confronted Cameron in our bedroom, I did not just lock down my bank accounts, Nia said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. I knew the federal agents had raided the corporate office and the family estate, but I also knew my husband. Cameron is a coward, but he is incredibly sneaky when hiding his personal toys from the government. She grabbed the thick leather straps of her oversized designer tote bag and hauled it onto the table between our coffee cups. She unzipped the main compartment and reached inside. I watched intently, expecting her to pull out financial documents or perhaps a hidden ledger. Instead, she extracted a sleek, heavy piece of hardware. It was a matte black military-grade encrypted laptop. The device was visibly bulky, perfectly designed for heavy processing power rather than simple daily portability. She placed it gently on the table and slid it directly across the surface until it rested mere inches from my hands. I stared at the dark metal casing. I recognized the brand instantly. It was a specialized machine favored by cryptocurrency traders for its biometric security and localized encryption capabilities. The federal agents took his desktop computer from the corporate office, Nia explained, her tone sharp. They probably confiscated his tablet and smartphone during the raid this morning. But this is his personal encrypted laptop. He kept it hidden in a false bottom drawer inside my custom vanity. He thought I never noticed his hiding spot because he assumed I only cared about makeup and jewelry. He underestimated how much attention I pay to my own physical space. I reached out and ran my fingers over the cold metal casing. The implications of possessing this specific device were absolutely staggering. When I executed my forensic autopsy last night, I had to trace the network logs and IP addresses from the corporate server. I could prove Cameron authorized the transaction using his residential network. However, the corporate server only held the outward-facing receipt of the wire transfer. This machine held the actual internal data. This laptop was the exact device Cameron used to physically access the unregulated cryptocurrency exchange. He was panicked when tearing through the bedroom, looking for my banking tokens, Nia continued. But he was also terrified about leaving this machine behind. He kept glancing toward the vanity, waiting for me to leave the room so he could grab it and run. He planned to take my $300,000. He wanted to use this drive to access whatever digital scraps he had hidden offshore. He genuinely wanted to vanish without a trace. I opened the laptop screen. A biometric scanning prompt illuminated, followed by a request for a complex decryption key. I could not access the files immediately, but I knew the FBI Cyber Division could crack it within an hour. They possessed the localized tools required to breach it. This drive holds the raw, undeleted transaction logs, I said, feeling a thrill of victory rushing through my veins. Cameron is arrogant enough to believe local encryption makes him invisible to the law. He definitely did not wipe the local cache before the market crash. This hard drive contains the direct ledger linking the stolen corporate funds to his personal digital wallet addresses. It will clearly show the exact trades he made, the precise timestamp of his financial losses, and every single footprint he tried to hide from the federal government today. Nia leaned across the small table. Her face was completely stoic, betraying absolutely no remorse for the man she had married. She looked at the laptop, then looked directly into my eyes. "Burn him," Nia said. The two words were simple, exceptionally cold, and utterly devastating. She was handing me the final iron nail for his prison coffin, willingly offering up her own husband to the unforgiving federal justice system. She was actively choosing truth over toxic family loyalty. I placed my right hand firmly on top of the laptop. "Consider him ashes," I replied. "I will hand this directly to Detective Ramirez tomorrow morning. The prosecution will not even need to offer him a generous plea deal. The evidence contained on this specific drive will guarantee a maximum sentence for wire fraud." Nia nodded slowly, taking a deep breath as the reality of her decision settled. She had protected herself today, but she was entering a brutal legal battlefield. Cynthia and Richard would unleash their remaining venom on her. They would claim her salon business as a marital asset to pay their legal fees. I pushed my coffee cup aside and matched her gaze. "You handed me the missing link, Nia. Now it is my turn to protect you. I know exactly how Richard and Cameron structured their finances. They are going to come after your business. They will hire aggressive attorneys to claim your franchise was built using commingled marital funds." Nia tightened her jaw. "I built every salon with my own sweat. Cameron never contributed a single dime. And I will prove it," I stated with certainty. "I will use every forensic skill I possess to ensure you get a ruthless, airtight divorce settlement. I will audit your marital history. I will trace every dollar you earned and separate it from his accounts. I will build a financial wall so high that their lawyers will break their teeth trying to bite into your assets. I will protect every penny of your business." A smile broke across Nia's face. It was the smile of a woman securing the ultimate insurance policy. She reached across the table and shook my hand. We had forged an unbreakable alliance. The scapegoat daughter and outsider daughter-in-law were about to conquer the empire. One exact week later, the corporate headquarters of our family real estate firm felt like a heavily fortified bunker. Despite the federal raid and the devastating asset freeze, Richard refused to surrender his illusion of absolute power. Desperate to maintain a vice grip on his rapidly collapsing empire, my father called an emergency, highly confidential board meeting. He bypassed the standard corporate notification protocols. quietly summoning only the minority shareholders, senior regional partners, and his most loyal executive directors. They gathered in the primary executive boardroom on the top floor. The atmosphere inside the room was incredibly toxic, thick with unspoken panic and the smell of stale coffee. The minority partners sat rigidly in their high-backed leather chairs, whispering nervously among themselves. They had spent the last 7 days dodging phone calls from furious investors and panicked contractors. The corporate bank accounts remained entirely frozen by the federal government. The company was bleeding out rapidly, and these men were terrified of losing their own personal fortunes. But Richard did not look like a man facing a 10-year federal prison sentence for wire fraud. He sat at the very head of the long mahogany table, projecting a chilling, entirely fabricated aura of supreme confidence. He wore his most expensive, custom-tailored charcoal suit, adjusting his silk tie with practiced ease. Richard firmly believed he still held the ultimate trump card. In his arrogant mind, the federal investigation was merely a temporary bureaucratic hurdle that his expensive lawyers would eventually demolish. More importantly, he operated under the absolute certainty that he still retained a 51% controlling majority of the company voting shares. He thought his position as the chief executive officer was permanently secured by that simple mathematical advantage. He believed he could single-handedly force the board to execute his desperate survival strategy. He tapped his gold-plated pen against the polished mahogany surface, calling the chaotic room to order. The terrified murmurs immediately died down. Richard cleared his throat, leaning forward to dominate the physical space of the room. He thanked them all for attending on such incredibly short notice, attempting to weave a narrative of corporate solidarity. He assured the nervous shareholders that the recent federal raid was nothing more than a gross misunderstanding, a minor hiccup that would be entirely resolved by the end of the fiscal quarter. He lied through his teeth without a single flinch, completely ignoring the reality of the airtight forensic evidence I had submitted. His primary goal for this emergency meeting was character assassination. He needed to completely discredit my federal whistleblower report before the minority partners realized the company was actually bankrupt. Richard looked around the room, lowering his voice to a tone of deep manufactured paternal sorrow. He told the board that the entire federal investigation was triggered by the malicious actions of a deeply unstable, disgruntled employee. He officially named me as the sole architect of the crisis. He wove a pathetic, manipulative story claiming that my recent mental health had severely deteriorated. He told them I had grown violently jealous of my brother Cameron and his supposedly brilliant success within the firm. He conveniently referenced the public argument at the anniversary gala, twisting the narrative to make it sound like I had suffered a massive public psychological breakdown simply because I was denied a corporate promotion. According to Richard, I had fabricated the embezzlement charges out of pure spiteful vengeance. He painted himself as the tragic, loving father who was now being forced to make an incredibly painful professional decision to protect the legacy of the company. Richard then transitioned from playing the victim to acting as the ruthless corporate dictator. He laid out his aggressive, multi-step survival plan to the board. First, he demanded an immediate unanimous vote to officially and permanently terminate my employment as the lead internal auditor. He insisted that severing my ties to the company would invalidate my access to the internal servers and help their legal team suppress the forensic evidence I had submitted to the authorities. Second, and far more desperately, he proposed a massive immediate liquidation of several key commercial real estate assets. Since the primary operating accounts were completely frozen by the federal court order, Richard needed liquid capital fast. He instructed the board to approve the fire sale of 3 prime downtown properties at significantly below market value. He claimed this generated cash would be used to pay off frantic contractors and keep the company afloat. But the minority partners were not entirely stupid. They knew the truth. Richard needed that unencumbered cash to pay his lawyers massive retainer fees and secure a team of elite criminal defense attorneys for himself and Cameron. He was actively trying to cannibalize the company portfolio to save his own skin. The minority shareholders exchanged terrified, hesitant glances. Selling off prime real estate at a massive loss was financial suicide for the firm, but they were deeply intimidated by Richard. He had ruled the boardroom through fear and aggressive retaliation for decades. None of them wanted to be the first to speak out against a man they believed held the 51% controlling stake. If they voted against him and he survived the federal probe, he would systematically destroy their careers. Richard sensed their cowardly hesitation and smiled coldly. He leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his arms over his chest. He reminded them that this was not a debate. It was an executive directive. He told them that as the majority shareholder, he had the absolute right to force the liquidation vote through regardless of their objections, but he preferred they present a united front to the media. He picked up his gold pen, preparing to sign the official termination papers that would end my career and the liquidation orders that would drain the company dry. He asked if there were any final objections before he called the formal vote. Before Richard could even call for the formal vote, the heavy oak doors of the executive boardroom swung violently open. The solid wood hit the magnetic stoppers with a loud, resounding crash that echoed through the tense room. Every single minority shareholder flinched in their leather chairs, turning their heads toward the entrance in absolute shock. Richard dropped his gold-plated pen, his head snapping up as his carefully constructed illusion of total control was instantly shattered. I stepped over the threshold and walked directly into the room. I did not sneak in. I did not look down. I marched into the corporate sanctuary wearing a pristine charcoal suit projecting an aura of absolute unyielding authority. I was not alone. I was flanked not by local police officers or federal agents, but by a highly intimidating team of 4 razor-sharp corporate litigators. These were not the usual firm attorneys who played golf with my father. These were apex predators from the most ruthless financial litigation firm in the city, men and women who specialized in hostile corporate takeovers and executive removals. The sheer visual impact of our entrance completely paralyzed the room. The minority partners stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, completely unsure of what was happening. They had just spent the last 20 minutes listening to my father paint me as an unstable, hysterical woman who had suffered a catastrophic mental breakdown. Yet here I was, looking sharper, colder, and far more professional than anyone else sitting at that mahogany table. My posture completely contradicted every single lie my father had just fed them. Richard stared at me from the head of the table. The initial shock on his face rapidly morphed into a blinding, irrational fury. The veins in his neck bulged against his silk collar, and his face turned a deep, dangerous shade of purple. He pushed his chair back so aggressively that it tipped over and crashed onto the floor. He slammed both of his hands flat against the mahogany surface, leaning forward like a rabid dog ready to attack. "Security!" Richard roared, his voice booming through the boardroom with a terrifying volume. "Get in here right now! Remove this woman immediately! She is officially fired. Escort her out of this building before I call the police." 2 large security guards had been stationed just outside the boardroom doors, tasked with ensuring the emergency meeting remained entirely confidential. Upon hearing the screaming CEO, they stepped into the room, their hands instinctively moving toward their radios. They looked at me, then looked at my father, clearly expecting an easy physical removal of a disgruntled employee. But they did not move a single muscle toward me. My lead litigator, a tall woman named Carmen, stepped slightly ahead of me. She did not raise her voice. She simply locked eyes with the head security guard and shook her head once. She held up a thick manila folder bearing a bright red federal injunction stamp. The gesture was completely silent, but carried an overwhelming amount of legal threat. The security guards, recognizing the severe consequences of interfering with a federal legal team, immediately stopped in their tracks. They shifted uncomfortably on their feet, glancing nervously at each other. They took a deliberate step backward, lowering their hands and completely ignoring my father and his frantic commands. Richard witnessed the blatant insubordination of his own security staff and completely lost his mind. He turned his purple, enraged face toward his loyal corporate attorney, who was sitting near the front of the table looking incredibly pale. Gallagher Richard screamed, spittle flying from his lips. Call the precinct right this second, have her arrested for criminal trespassing, have her thrown in a cell for corporate espionage. Do your job and get her out of my sight." Mr. Gallagher did not reach for his phone. He did not say a word to defend his client. The lawyer simply stared at the team of elite litigators standing behind me, realizing instantly that they outranked him in every conceivable legal arena. He swallowed hard, keeping his hands flat on the table, completely paralyzed by the shifting power dynamics. I ignored my father and his hysterical shouting. I ignored the terrified minority shareholders. I walked forward, my heels clicking methodically against the hardwood floor. The sound was steady and rhythmic, measuring the exact remaining seconds of my father and his corporate reign. I walked past the nervous security guards. I walked past the sweating board members. I walked the entire length of the massive mahogany table, forcing every single person in the room to watch my slow, deliberate approach. Richard watched me coming closer, his breathing ragged and shallow. He tried to maintain his intimidating glare, but his hands were trembling visibly against the polished wood. He was entirely trapped at the head of the table, surrounded by his silent, cowardly partners. I reached the opposite end of the table, stopping directly across from him. We stood face to face, separated only by the long expanse of mahogany. The contrast between us was stark. He was a sweating, screaming, terrified old man grasping at his crumbling empire. I was a calm, calculating professional who had already burned that empire to the ground. The entire room seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting for the final execution blow. No one dared to look away from the inevitable destruction unfolding before them. This was not a negotiation anymore. This was an absolute corporate slaughter happening in real time. I smiled very coldly, then slowly lifted my heavy leather briefcase and placed it squarely on the center of the table. The soft thud echoed in the dead silent room. I popped the brass latches, opened the lid, and looked my father directly in the eyes. I simply did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with a quiet, lethal clarity that paralyzed everyone in the room. "You cannot fire the majority shareholder, Richard," I stated. The absolute silence in the boardroom stretched so tight it felt like it might physically snap. Richard stared at me, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to process the words I had just spoken. He looked around the room, expecting someone to laugh at what he clearly believed was an absurd, desperate bluff. No one laughed. The minority partners sat completely frozen in their high-backed leather chairs, their eyes darting between my father's purple face and the imposing legal team flanking my sides. I reached into my open briefcase and retrieved a thick stack of pristine, legally certified documents. Each packet was bound with heavy legal clasps and stamped with the official seal of the state probate court. I handed the stack to Carmen, my lead litigator. She moved around the long mahogany table with predatory grace, placing a copy directly in front of every single board member shareholder, and finally sliding one across the polished wood to stop right at my father's trembling fingertips. "Read the cover page," Richard Ice instructed, my voice carrying the sharp, cold ring of absolute finality. "You have spent your entire career believing you were the untouchable king of this corporate empire. You told everyone who would listen that you built this company with your own two hands. But we both know that is a complete lie. My grandfather built this firm. You merely inherited the corner office because you happened to share his last name. But my grandfather was a brilliant, pragmatic man. He was far too smart to simply hand over his life work to a man who possessed no financial discipline and absolutely no moral compass." Richard stared down at the document, his hands shaking so violently he could barely turn the thick cover page. I did not wait for him to read it. I wanted to deliver the crushing blows personally, verbally executing his corporate reign in front of the audience he had summoned. "My grandfather knew exactly what you were," Richard, I stated, stepping away from the end of the table and walking slowly down the side of the room. "He watched you squander capital on terrible investments. He saw you promote your incompetent golden child Cameron while ignoring genuine talent. He knew that if he handed you the absolute control of this real estate portfolio, you would inevitably bankrupt the entire family. So he made a very different, highly classified arrangement. Gallagher, sitting near the front, practically scrambled to open his copy of the packet. He began speed reading the densely packed legal text, his eyes growing wider with every passing second. A low, terrified gasp escaped the lawyer's lips. "My grandfather never left you the controlling stake," I revealed, letting the truth detonate in the confined space. "When he passed away, he placed exactly 60% of the primary voting shares into a highly secretive, irrevocable blind trust. You were never the absolute owner of this company. Your legal title, which you conveniently chose to ignore, was merely interim managing director. You were essentially a glorified placeholder, a babysitter tasked with keeping the lights on until the true successor came of age." "That is impossible!" Richard croaked, his voice cracking horribly. He slammed a fist weakly against the table. "I hold 51%. The voting rights are mine. I have executed every major board decision for the last decade. You operated with perceived authority because the blind trust mandated total secrecy until a very specific triggering event occurred," I countered smoothly. "The legal stipulation my grandfather established was flawless. The 60% controlling share was held securely in the shadows until I reached an age where I possessed the professional credentials, the financial acumen, and the personal fortitude to properly manage the empire. The shares were programmed to automatically and irreversibly transfer directly into my name on my 33rd birthday." I paused, letting my gaze sweep across the faces of the terrified minority shareholders before locking eyes with my father again. "My 33rd birthday occurred exactly 1 week before the anniversary gala," I said. "I was the legally recognized majority shareholder of this entire corporation when you dragged me into that coat room. I was the majority owner when you screamed at me in front of 40 guests. You grounded your own boss, Richard." The air vanished from my father's lungs. He clutched his chest, sinking heavily into his overturned chair that he had somehow managed to right. But I was not finished. The financial guillotine was only halfway down its track. Furthermore, I continued pulling a specific page from my own copy of the dossier and holding it up. "My grandfather was a meticulous man who anticipated your exact flavor of corruption. He included a very strict ethics and morality clause within the foundational bylaws of the trust transfer. The clause explicitly states that if the interim managing director is found to be engaged in any form of criminal fraud, gross financial negligence, or corporate embezzlement, they instantly violate their fiduciary duty. The penalty for that violation is not a slap on the wrist." Carmen stepped forward, pointing to a highlighted paragraph in the documents resting before the board members. "The penalty is the immediate non-negotiable forfeiture of all remaining minority shares held by the offending director," she announced, her legal tone ringing like a death knell. I looked down at the pathetic, sweating man who had tormented me for my entire life. "Your attempt to cover up Cameron stealing $2.5 million triggered the ethics clause the absolute second I handed that forensic evidence to the Federal Bureau of Investigation yesterday morning. You do not own 51% anymore, Richard. You do not own 10%. You do not own a single solitary fraction of a percent of this firm. You never truly owned the company. I did. And as of this morning, thanks to your own staggering criminal incompetence, I own your remaining shares too." My words crushed the breath from my father's lungs. The room spun around him. He gripped the mahogany table, knuckles bone white, anchoring himself to an empire that vaporized beneath his feet. He opened his mouth to scream, to issue another empty threat, but his vocal cords failed him. He was a hollow shell defeated by the daughter he spent a lifetime degrading. The boardroom doors swung wide open. Cameron stumbled into the room. My brother looked absolutely pathetic. He wore wrinkled travel clothes, his face slick with sweat. He had rushed from his condo, desperate to find our father after his confrontation with Nia. He ignored the heavy boardroom atmosphere and my legal team. He just saw Richard. "Dad, you have to help me," Cameron whined, his voice cracking hysterically. "Nia locked me out of everything. She froze her salon accounts, and I cannot secure the private charter flight to get out of the country. I need cash or I go to prison." A gasp rippled through the minority shareholders. My brother had just walked into a room full of corporate executives and openly confessed to attempting to flee federal jurisdiction. Richard closed his eyes, a look of profound physical agony washing over his face. He knew it was over. I stepped forward, reclaiming the absolute center of the room. As the legally recognized 60% majority owner of this corporation, I am calling an immediate board vote. I announced, my voice slicing through Cameron's frantic babbling. I propose the immediate permanent termination of Richard as Chief Executive Officer for gross financial negligence and breach of fiduciary duty. I also propose the immediate firing of Cameron from his position as Vice President for corporate embezzlement and wire fraud. All in favor? Every minority shareholder raised their hand instantly. They did not hesitate. They desperately wanted to distance themselves from my father and his toxic criminal reign. The motion carries, I stated coldly. You are both officially terminated, effective immediately. Cameron finally looked at me, his bloodshot eyes widening in sheer confusion. Olivia, what are you doing here? He stammered. Why are you sitting in the executive chair? Because I own the building, Cameron, I replied evenly. And since we are on the subject of real estate, there is one more item of corporate business we need to address. I turned my gaze back to my father, who was staring blankly at the polished wood. You always loved parading around that massive suburban estate, Richard. You loved acting like the king of the castle. But you forgot how you structured your own assets to avoid personal liability. The family mansion is not registered in your name. It is a corporate-owned asset. And as the new chief executive officer, I am liquidating unnecessary holdings to cover the financial damage your son caused. I signaled to Carmen. She pulled a single sheet of paper from her folder and slid it across the table. I am issuing you a formal 24-hour eviction notice, I declared. You have until tomorrow morning to pack whatever cheap clothes you can carry and vacate my property. Before either of them could process the reality of impending homelessness, two men in unremarkable suits walked purposefully into the boardroom. They bypassed the stunned security guards and approached my brother. Are you Cameron? One of the men asked. Cameron nodded dumbly. The man shoved a thick manila envelope against his chest. You have been served, the process server stated plainly. Cameron looked down at the documents. They were expedited divorce papers filed flawlessly by the ruthless legal team I had secured for Nia. They included an ironclad separation of assets that completely walled off her salon business, leaving him with absolutely nothing but his mounting criminal debt. He dropped the envelope onto the floor, his hands shaking violently. The timing was beautifully orchestrated. Before the heavy oak doors could even close behind the process servers, heavy tactical boots echoed down the corridor. Detective Ramirez strode into the boardroom, flanked by two uniformed police officers. Cameron, you are under arrest for violating the strict conditions of your federal bail, Ramirez announced, pulling out his handcuffs. We received an anonymous tip with audio evidence that you were actively attempting to secure a private international charter flight to evade prosecution. Put your hands behind your back. The golden child broke down entirely. He sobbed, begging our father to save him as the officers aggressively secured the steel cuffs around his wrists. Richard could do nothing but watch. Suddenly, my mother, Cynthia, burst through the doorway, having followed the police upstairs. She saw Cameron in handcuffs and Richard slumped in defeat. She ran toward me, tears streaming down her perfectly contoured face. Olivia, please, Cynthia wailed, reaching out for my arm. We are family. You cannot do this. Please, where will we live? I stepped back, ensuring she could not touch me. I looked at her with the exact same dead-cold eyes I had given my father at the anniversary gala. You told me I humiliated this family, I said softly, my voice devoid of any pity. Now I own this family. Get out of my building. The security guards, finally understanding who signed their paychecks, stepped forward and forcefully escorted my screaming mother, my broken father, and my arrested brother out of the boardroom. The minority partners quickly and silently filed out behind them, leaving me in total peace. I sat down completely alone at the very head of the massive mahogany table. I slowly turned my heavy leather chair to look out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling, sunlit city skyline stretching out endlessly below me. I had successfully saved my grandfather's company, gained a brilliant, fiercely loyal friend in Nia, and finally took out the toxic family trash. Have you ever had to stand up to the people who share your blood to protect the truth? Let me know your story in the comments below. The chilling narrative of Olivia dismantling her father's corrupt corporate empire leaves us with a profound realization. Loyalty is a virtue, but blind loyalty to a toxic family is a dangerous trap. For years, Olivia and her sister-in-law Nia were conditioned to accept their roles as the scapegoat and the outsider. They were expected to absorb psychological abuse, shield the incompetence of the entitled golden child, and sacrifice their own moral compasses just to protect a fragile criminal facade of wealth and status. The story teaches us that true strength lies not in silently enduring mistreatment, but in having the courage to finally draw an absolute line in the sand. Richard and Cameron built their entire lives on the false premise that volume intimidation and unearned entitlement could override facts and accountability. They fatally mistook Olivia's silence for weakness and her patience for submission. However, this narrative reminds us that the most formidable person in the room is rarely the one shouting the loudest. It is the one meticulously gathering the data. When the ultimate conflict arose, Olivia did not meet their emotional manipulation with tears, apologies, or compliance. She met it with cold, hard boundaries and irrefutable evidence. She proved that you do not owe your professional integrity, your financial security, or your mental well-being to people who only value you for what they can exploit. Walking away from blood relatives is one of the most agonizing decisions a person can ever make. Yet sometimes it is the only way to save yourself from drowning in their dysfunction. This story serves as a powerful reminder that our first loyalty must always be to our own truth and integrity. Take a moment today to evaluate the boundaries in your own life and find the courage to stand up to any relationship that demands you compromise your self-worth.